All right, guys, here we go. Chapter 8 Guard Dog and Backpacker, May 25th through July 1805. While Seaman was recovering, the countryside was changing. Leaving the grassy plains, the boats entered an area as dry as a desert. On each side of the river, the land rose into sandy cliffs. Sand blew into the explorers' faces, stinging their eyes and sticking to their skin. In this remote area, the explorers caught their first glimpse of the shining mountains the Indians had described. Looking toward the west, they could see the distant Rockies gleaming white in the sunshine. Although the mountains were a beautiful sight, the men shivered. They knew those shining peaks were covered with snow. Somehow, the corpse of Discovery would have to cross those frozen peaks to reach the western sea. The river twisted around endless curves, and the jagged cliffs slashed straight down into the water on both sides of a river. A strong downstream wind always blew. The men found that they could not sail or paddle the boats against the wind and current, so they pulled the boats with ropes. They cut their feet on the rocky river bottoms as they trudged through the water. Their ropes dried out and snapped, and the white pirogue was nearly lost once again, this time in the rocky water. As soon as the explorers solved one problem, another arose to slow their progress. As they continued west, the explorers recognized the area the Indians called the White Cliffs. Sandstone cliffs towered above them, 200 feet and higher. Their weathered surfaces were chipped and pitted. They looked like the windowed walls of ancient ruins. Although the men were very tired, they marveled at the stark scenery. It was as different from the green rolling landscape of the eastern United States as any place that they could imagine. During the night of May 29th, when everyone was sound asleep except one night guard, a buffalo accidentally blundered into the camp. The great hulk of a bull swam across the river and climbed right over the white pirogue, which was benched on a riverboat with both captains sleeping in it. Luckily, the massive animal, which weighed a ton or more, did not fall on the boat. The captains were not even roused by the sounds of its hooves crunching in the stony beach. 4 campfires were burning in the nearby camp, and the flickering blazes confused the bull. It snorted, terrified. Its sides twitched, and it stamped its hooves on the rocky ground. In a frantic search for an escape from the strange place, it began to run, swerving wildly from side to side. Seaman was dozing beside the guard by one of the campfires. Hearing the noise, he began to bark in the darkness. The guard called out, but the man could not figure out what was causing the commotion. Some of the explorers sat up, dazed with sleep. Others rolled over and reached for their firearms. The bull's panic increased as the darkened shapes on the ground began to move. It stampeded through the camp, trampling on a rifle and a gun. Its hooves came within inches of sleeping men's heads. Desperate to escape, it lowered its head and charged toward the tent where the sergeants, as well as Charbonneau, Sacagawea, and the baby slept. Seaman dashed through the camp, barking ferociously. The buffalo was only a few hundred yards away from ramming into the tent when Seaman caught up with it. Growling and snapping at the bull's heels, Seaman turned the buffalo away from the tent and he drove it out of the camp. While Seaman returned to the camp, everyone was awake. Men were checking the sleeping rolls to be sure nobody had been trampled. Miraculously, not a single person had been injured, and only a few firearms had been damaged. "Seaman, I don't know what we would do without you," Shannon exclaimed, spreading out his arms to hug the dog. Seaman jumped up and put his front paws on Shannon's chest and licked the young man's face. Then he trotted around the camp. Inside the tent, the dog spotted Charbonneau, who was muttering sleepily. The sergeants patted Seaman gratefully, delighted by their good fortunes. Sacagawea's baby had not even awakened. Lewis called Seaman to his side and stroked his head. "Thank God nobody was trampled by that beast," he said. "You saved our lives tonight, Seaman." For the next few weeks, Seaman's barking often woke the explorers during the night. In the mornings, the men sometimes discovered buffalo herds near the outskirts of the camp. Occasionally, they spotted signs of a grizzly. No matter how often the barking woke them up, none of the explorers ever complained. Seamen had become the camp's guard. The explorers proceeded on until they reached a fork in the river. Here the men stopped, puzzled. The river from the north was muddy. The river from the south was clear. Which waterway was the Missouri River? The men made camp and discussed the matter. The captains thought the clear river from the south was the Missouri, and that the river coming down from the north was only a tributary. Everyone else disagreed, thinking that the muddy river must be the Missouri. Finally, the captains decided to take scouting parties to explore both rivers. As soon as Lewis and his 6 scouts packed their gear for the trip, he called Seaman. He knelt and stroked the dog's chest. Then he walked over to Sacagawea with the dog by his side. "Sit, Seaman," Lewis said. Seaman sat obediently. He cocked his head and looked at Lewis. "That's right, Seaman, stay," Lewis said firmly, and he told Sacagawea, "Be sure Seaman stays in camp with you for a few hours." Sacagawea looked puzzled. "The dog's leg better?" she said. "He's strong now." "Yes, he's strong enough to run with my scouting party. But Seaman is best night guard that we have," Lewis explained. "Remember the night the buffalo stampeded through camp? Most of our people and all of our supplies will be here in camp. The dog should stay to keep you safe." Sacagawea nodded and smiled, and she laid her hand on Seaman's head. Clark's scouting party returned on June 6th, and Lewis's party returned on the 8th. The captains were convinced the Northern River was a tributary running out of the Northern Prairie, and not the Missouri River, which was believed to flow out of the Rocky Mountains. But the others still thought the Missouri was the Northern River. The captains decided to send out another scouting party to find a major landmark, the Missouri's gigantic waterfalls, which the Indians at Fort Mandan had described. As soon as they found those falls, they would know that they were on the right river. The plan was for Lewis to lead the scouting party to find the waterfalls. Once he found the Great Falls, Lewis would be in charge of deciding the best land route around it. Since the boats could not travel up the waterfalls, the men would have to portage, carrying all of their boats and supplies overland. Again, Lewis insisted on leaving Seaman as a camp guard. "Meriwether," Clark declared, "I fear you're going to break your dog's heart." When my scouting party arrived back in camp, Seaman was still moping around looking miserable. Lewis called Seaman to his side and knelt to gaze into the dog's brown eyes. "Seaman," Lewis said, "your job is to guard our camp. It's a very important job. Your senses are so keen that you're the best guard we have." Seaman's tail swished back and forth along the ground. He nuzzled Lewis's hand. Lewis turned to Clark. "William, I'd love to take Seaman with me, but I promised President Jefferson I'd give my life if necessary to make the expedition a success, and I meant it. The camp is safer when Seaman is here. He needs to stay." So it was decided. On June 11th, Lewis took 4 men to explore the Southern River, and Seaman remained with Clark in camp. The men began to prepare for the portage around the Great Falls. To lighten their load, they divided their supplies. Some to be taken on the trip west, and the rest to be stored in a cache. Let's see how this is pronounced.
Cache.
In a cache, a place of hiding, storing, or preserving treasure. The men dug a large hole to make a cache. They left some tightly sealed kegs of dried food and a keg of salt in the hole. They also left heavy tools, like the blacksmith bellows, some of the guns, and gunpowder. Since the pirogues...
Pirogue.
Got it right. I don't know why I questioned myself there. They planned to leave the second... Wait, did I just skip ahead? Yes. Since the pirogues were too big and awkward for travel on the smaller headwaters of the Missouri, the men left one of them on top of the cache. They planned to leave the second pirogue in another cache farther upriver. They threw dirt and branches and leaves on the pile and concealed it so neither animals nor Indians would find their supplies. The men planned to pick up the pirogues and the supplies on their return trip. Lewis's scouting party found the Great Falls of the Missouri on June 13th. It was even more spectacular than the Indians had described. In his journal, Lewis called it the grandest sight I ever beheld. As soon as he located this landmark, Lewis knew that he and Clark had been correct. The Southern River the clear river was the Missouri. I don't know why the page isn't turning, y'all. There we go. Sorry about that. Unfortunately, Great Falls was not a single waterfall. Instead, it was 5 separate, mighty waterfalls with rapids between them. This was very bad news because it meant that the men would have to carry the boats and supplies much further than they expected, nearly 20 miles over rough ground. As Lewis returned to camp, seamen ran to meet him. He barked excitedly. Lewis put out his hand to stroke the dog, but seamen turned and dashed away, leading the men toward camp. He stopped several yards down the trail and barked again. His barks were short, loud, and urgent. Lewis was at first puzzled by Seaman's behavior. Suddenly, he understood. "Something's wrong," he shouted, and the men in his scouting party. They began to run, following Seaman toward camp. Clark greeted the party with bad news. "It's Sacagawea," he explained in worried look on her face. "She took ill after you left. It seems to be her stomach. I've tried everything I could think of, but it doesn't seem to be getting any better." Striding quickly to the tent with Seaman by his side, Lewis was alarmed by what he found. Sacagawea was very weak with a high fever and strained breathing. She said she had awful pains in her abdomen. Seaman licked the young woman's face, nuzzling her gently. She smiled faintly, and she reached her weak hand up to pat the dog's chest. As he examined the Indian woman, Lewis recalled Sergeant Floyd, who had died with a stomach complaint in the early months of their journey. None of their remedies had saved the young sergeant, and all of the men greatly saddened by this death. Now the captain prayed for his skill to save the young Indian mother. Since he did not know the cause of the illness, Lewis treated Sacagawea by restricting her diet to mineral water from a nearby spring. To relieve the pain, he laid warm, moist cloths on her abdomen and gave her medicines that he had brought on the journey. He watched her carefully, responding to each of her symptoms. He had tried a similar approach on the Sergeant Floyd, but this time everybody's relief, Lewis's doctoring, seemed to help. While Sacagawea slowly grew stronger, the men took turns caring for her son. By now, Jean-Baptiste was a healthy, fat 4-month-old. His little round face and his funny, gurgling sounds enchanted everybody in the corps. York moistened the parched corn that they had brought from Fort Mandan to make mush for him to eat. The men played peekaboo with him, while York fed him with a spoon. If the baby squirmed, Seaman darted to his side and licked his chubby toes. Whenever he had a minute, Captain Clark picked the baby up and bounced him gently on his knee, and if the baby cried, Clark held him close against his shoulder while he hummed tunes from his own nursery days. The baby usually sat such a serious expression on his face that Clark nicknamed him Pomp. Soon, all the explorers called him Pomp. During Sacagawea's illness, the men got ready for the portage. Fortunately, after the expedition had left the White Cliffs, they entered grassy countryside again. Small trees grew along the banks of the river, and the men cut them down for wood to make into wagons. They sawed across sections from the trunk of cottonwood tree to get large wooden circles that could be used as wheels. Then they uploaded supplies to their makeshift wagons. They were going to have to push, pull, or carry the wagons nearly 20 miles around the falls to reach the place where the river's waters were calmly enough for the boats again. They also made a second cache of supplies and left the white pirogue in it. And I'm going to pick up here on the next video, y'all.